The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Forced Men Usurping Places to Vacate. The boats were lowered one by one, and as I stood by, my husband said to me, "Thank God for Archie Butt." Perhaps Major Butt heard it, for he turned his face towards us for a second and smiled. Just at that moment a young man was arguing to get into a lifeboat, and Major Butt had a hold of the lad by the arm, like a big brother, and was telling him to keep his head and be a man. Major Butt helped those poor frightened steerage people so wonderfully, so tenderly, and yet with such cool and manly firmness that he prevented the loss of many lives from panic. He was a soldier to the last. He was one of God's greatest noblemen, and I think I can say he was an example of bravery, even to men on the ship. Last words of Major Butt. Miss Marie Young, who was a music instructor to President Roosevelt's children and had known Major Butt during the Roosevelt occupancy of the White House, told this story of his heroism. "Archie himself put me into the boat, wrapped blankets around me, and tucked me in as carefully as if we were starting on a motor ride. He himself entered the boat with me, performing the little courtesies as calmly and with as smiling a face as if death were far away, instead of being but a few moments removed from him. When he had carefully wrapped me up, he stepped upon the gunwale of the boat, and lifting his hat, smiled down at me. 'Good-bye, Miss Young,' he said. 'Good luck to you, and don't forget to remember me to the folks back home.' Then he stepped back and waved his hand to me as the boat was lowered. I think I was the last woman he had a chance to help, for the boat went down shortly after we cleared the suction zone." Colonel Astor, another hero. Colonel Astor was another of the heroes of the awful night. Effort was made to persuade him to take a place in one of the lifeboats, but he emphatically refused to do so until every woman and child on board had been provided for, not excepting the women members of the ship's company. One of the passengers describing the consummate courage of Colonel Astor said, "He led Mrs. Astor to the side of the ship and helped her to the lifeboat to which she had been assigned. I saw that she was prostrated and said she would remain and take her chances with him, but Colonel Astor quietly insisted and tried to reassure her in a few words. As she took her place in the boat, her eyes were fixed upon him. Colonel Astor smiled, touched his cap, and when the boat moved safely away from the ship's side, he turned back to his place among the men." Mrs. Ida S. Hippach and her daughter Jean, survivors of the Titanic, said they were saved by Colonel John Jacob Astor, who forced the crew of the last lifeboat to wait for them. "We saw Colonel Astor place Mrs. Astor in a boat and assure her that he would follow her later," said Mrs. Hippach. "He turned to us with a smile and said, 'Ladies, you are next.' The officer in charge of the boat protested that the craft was full, and the seamen started to lower it. Colonel Astor exclaimed, 'Hold that boat,' in the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, and they did as he ordered. The boat had been lowered past the upper deck, and the colonel took us to the deck below and put us in the boat, one after the other, through a porthole." Heartbreaking scenes. There were some terrible scenes. Fathers were parting from their children and giving them an encouraging pat on the shoulders. Men were kissing their wives and telling them that they would be with them shortly. One man said there was absolutely no danger, that the boat was the finest ever built, with watertight compartments, and that it could not sink. That seemed to be the general impression. A few of the men, however, were panic-stricken even when the first of the 56-foot lifeboats was being filled. Fully 10 men threw themselves into the boats, already crowded with women and children. These men were dragged back and hurled sprawling across the deck. 6 of them screamed with fear, struggled to their feet, and made a second attempt to rush the boats. About 10 shots sounded in quick succession. The 6 cowardly men were stopped in their tracks, staggered and collapsed one after another. At least 2 of them vainly attempted to creep towards the boats again. The others lay quite still. This scene of bloodshed served its purpose. In that particular section of the deck there was no further attempt to violate the rule of women and children first. I helped fill the boats with women. said Thomas Whiteley, who was a waiter on the Titanic. "Collapsible boat number 2 on the starboard side jammed. The second officer was hacking at the ropes with a knife when I was being dragged around the deck by that rope when I looked up and saw the boat, with all aboard, turn turtle. In some way I got overboard myself and clung to an oak dresser. I wasn't more than 60 feet from the Titanic when she went down. Her big stern rose up in the air, and she went down bow first. I saw all the machinery drop out of her." Henry B. Harris. Henry B. Harris of New York, a theatrical manager, was one of the men who showed superb courage in the crisis. When the lifeboats were first being filled, and before there was any panic, Mr. Harris went to the side of his wife before the boat was lowered away. "Women first!" shouted one of the ship's officers. Mr. Harris glanced up and saw that the remark was addressed to him. "All right," he replied coolly. "Good-bye, my dear," he said as he kissed his wife, pressed her a moment to his breast, and then climbed back to the Titanic's deck. 3 explosions. Up to this time there had been no panic, but about 1 hour before the ship plunged to the bottom there were 3 separate explosions of bulkheads as the vessel filled. These were at intervals of about 15 minutes. From that time there was a different scene. The rush for the remaining boats became a stampede. The stokers rushed up from below and tried to beat a path through the steerage men and women and through the sailors and officers to get into the boats. They had their iron bars and shovels, and they struck down all who stood in their way. The first to come up from the depths of the ship was an engineer. From what he is reported to have said, it is probable that the steam fittings were broken and many were scalded to death when the Titanic lifted. He said he had to dash through a narrow place beside a broken pipe, and his back was frightfully scalded. Right at his heels came the stokers. The officers had pistols, but they could not use them at first for fear of killing the women and children. The sailors fought with their fists, and many of them took the stoke bars and shovels from the stokers and used them to beat back the others. Many of the coal passers and stokers who had been driven back from the boats went to the rail, and whenever a boat was filled and lowered, several of them jumped overboard and swam toward it, trying to climb aboard. Several of the survivors said that the men who swam to the sides of their boats were pulled in or climbed in. Dozens of the cabin passengers were witnesses of some of the frightful scenes on the steerage deck. The steerage survivors said that 10 women from the upper decks were the only cool passengers in the lifeboat, and they tried to quiet the steerage women, who were nearly all crazed with fear and grief.